What if I told you history almost repeated itself, and no one even noticed? Michael, a history student, and Emily, a young journalist, sat across from former U.S. President George W. Bush, their eyes locked on him. "There's something people don't know about my presidency," Bush said, his voice steady but firm. "A warning came too late, a mistake we barely avoided, and one that could still happen again." Michael leaned forward. "What warning?" Bush exhaled, his gaze distant. "We were heading toward another Great Depression, and nobody wanted to believe it." Emily, gripping her pen, asked, "Then why hasn't anyone heard about this?" Bush gave a small smile. "Because history doesn't scream when it repeats itself. It whispers." The room fell silent as Bush took a deep breath. "And if people don't listen," he continued, "they'll wake up to the same disaster we barely avoided." That's when the lesson began. It was 2006, and while the world's attention was on the Iraq War and terrorism, another crisis was building behind closed doors. One morning, Bush received a classified economic report. Banks were making reckless loans. The housing market was spiraling out of control. Corporate greed was fueling a financial bubble. A single line in the report sent chills down Bush's spine. "Mr. President, if this continues, we could face an economic collapse worse than 1929. Bush leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers. "Tell me this isn't real," he muttered. But it was real. And if history was any indication, the worst was yet to come. Bush called an emergency meeting with his top financial advisors. "We have a problem," he said, handing them the report. One advisor cleared his throat. "Mr. President, this is serious, but not immediate. The economy is strong." Bush narrowed his eyes. "So was it in 1929, and then the stock market crashed overnight." His advisors hesitated. "If we act now, it could cause unnecessary panic. If we wait too long, we won't be able to stop it. We have no perfect solution." Bush sighed. "Then let's fix it quietly, before disaster strikes." But history had other plans. By 2007, the cracks in the system became impossible to ignore. The housing market was crashing. Banks were failing. Families were drowning in debt. Bush knew the crisis was getting worse. "Can we stop it?" he asked his advisors. One of them shook his head. "We're out of time." And then, in 2008, the inevitable happened. The stock market collapsed. Major banks shut down. Millions lost their jobs. Emily and Michael were frozen in their seats as Bush continued. "I tried to warn them, but nobody listens until it's too late." Bush was faced with an impossible choice. Let the banks fail, triggering total economic collapse. Bail them out and take the blame for saving Wall Street. There was no winning. "I had to make a decision," Bush said, rubbing his hands together. "Save the economy, or watch it burn." Michael frowned. "But wasn't that the same mistake made in 1929? The government did nothing, and the world suffered for years." Bush nodded. "That's why we did what we did." A $700 billion bailout was approved. The economy was saved, but at a cost. The public was furious. "Why are we saving the banks? Why not help the people who lost their homes? Why should taxpayers pay for Wall Street's greed?" "I knew they'd hate me for it," Bush admitted. "But if we did nothing, they would have hated me even more for what came next." Years passed, and Bush watched in frustration. Big banks were taking risks again. Corporate greed was rising. People had already forgotten how close they came to financial ruin. Michael shook his head. "So, are we heading toward another financial disaster?" Bush sighed. "Not are. When?" Emily tightened her grip on her pen. "Then why isn't anyone doing anything?" Bush smirked. "Because history doesn't repeat itself. But it rhymes." The room went silent. Emily and Michael exchanged glances. This wasn't just a history lesson. It was a warning for the future. Michael and Emily stood up, their minds racing. "So what happens next?" Michael asked. Bush looked at them for a long moment before answering. "That's up to your generation." The young journalist closed her notebook. Would the world listen this time? Or was another disaster already on its way? A week had passed since the conversation with Bush, yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that his warning was more than just a history lesson. It was a prediction. She sat at her desk, scrolling through recent financial reports, banking statements, and government projections. Corporate debt had reached record highs. Banks were once again issuing high-risk loans. Stock markets were climbing at a rate eerily similar to 2007. Her heart pounded as she clicked on a confidential financial report she had received from an anonymous source. "Market instability is increasing. If unchecked, we could face another collapse within the next decade." Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "This is it! It's happening again!" She immediately called Michael. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tense. Within minutes, she sent him everything she had found. A long silence followed. Then Michael spoke. "This looks exactly like what happened before 2008. But the public doesn't know. Or they don't want to know." Emily exhaled sharply. "That's the problem. No one wants to believe history can repeat itself." Michael hesitated before asking the question on both their minds. "Do you think Bush knew this was coming?" Emily's stomach turned. "Not just knew," she whispered. "He tried to warn us." But no one had listened then. Would they listen now? Emily wasted no time. She wrote an explosive article titled, "The Economic Warning No One is Talking About." She laid out the facts, linking today's rising debt, reckless lending, and corporate greed to the same patterns that led to the 2008 crash. She quoted Bush's unspoken warning. She exposed the hidden risks in the financial sector. She called on the public to pay attention before it was too late. Within hours of publication, the article went viral. Financial analysts debated it. Politicians dismissed it. The public was divided. This is just fear-mongering. She's overreacting. The economy is stronger than ever. What if she's right? At the same time, government officials scrambled behind the scenes. Emily's inbox flooded with emails from anonymous insiders. "You're onto something. Keep digging. There's more to this than you know. Watch your back." She knew she had touched a nerve. Michael called her, his voice serious. "Emily, you just did what Bush couldn't." She let out a nervous laugh. "I don't think that's a good thing." Meanwhile, in his quiet Texas ranch, Bush saw the news. He sat in his chair, staring at the TV. The headline flashed across the screen. "Is another financial collapse coming?" He picked up the remote, turned off the television, and sighed. At least someone is paying attention this time. The lesson had been given, but the question remained. Would the world listen this time? Or was another disaster already in motion?